My name is Dr. Jed Applerouth. I'm the founder of Applerouth Tutoring Services. Been working in the space for just shy of 20 years. As of October, it'll be 20 years. And this has been a pretty wild year in the world of admissions in terms of the things we've seen, how testing has changed, how testing has shifted. Let me open my Q&A. I see a question already there. Will this webinar be recorded? Yes. Excellent question. We're going to have a recording of this webinar, which we're going to send them out, I think, on Friday. We tend to send out our content. We'll also send a copy of the deck. So you'll be able to look at the slides at your convenience, and also you'll be able to hear the recording and so forth. So, all right, well, let's jump in. So tonight I'll do my deck. I hope I'll answer a lot of your questions with my slides, and then we'll have time for question and answer at the end. So let's jump in. Okay. All right. So to begin with, a few quick hits, things that have changed. There were one of the big announcements in February. It's now, it'll affect our tonight's talk a little bit. The end of the SAT subject tests. That was a big change. Those have been around for about 50 years. I took them when I applied to school in the 90s, and those were sunset in February. So now gone forever, and that'll simplify things quite a bit. The essay for the SAT and the ACT, those are also gone. I'm sorry, for the SAT, it's gone. And then for the ACT, we are expecting it to be gone. They haven't announced it yet. It's still there on the books. But with the absence of the SAT essay, it really, its place in admissions is going to be so tiny, so marginal, and really of minimal, if any, relevance. So I wouldn't worry about it. I'm assuming it'll be gone within a matter of 6 months or so. Okay. And ultimately, part of the rationale was the SAT test for subjects. They were just in a small decline. Then the pandemic hit, and the majority of kids took these things during May and June. And alas, May and June of the pandemic, 2020, there were no tests. So the number of kids taking these tests last year fell off a cliff. And they said, this is probably a good year to retire these. They really weren't money makers. There were some problems with security. They really weren't writing tests that were being taken by a small number of people. And all their growth, all their profits, they're going to the AP exams are just crushing it. And so AP growth has said, you know what, why don't we bet on that, keep pushing those and not worry so much about the test for the subjects. And I see there are some questions coming in. Go ahead and load them up. I will get to the questions in sequence when I get to the end of the session. All right. Now, testing, where does it fit? In a pre-pandemic world, testing was third. Testing, there were grades in all courses, grades in your academic core classes, academic rigor, your GPA, number of APs, number of honors, IB, so forth, dual enrollment classes, and then testing. And those are the big ones, your GPA, your rigor testing, and then everything else quite a bit lower in terms of your essay, demonstrated interest, council rec, so forth. Now, in terms of next year, this slide is going to change. The SAT, ACT scores being given considerable importance. What I expect to see is a lot of that weight move from considerable to moderate importance, and in that shift. And there will be some schools where it goes to limited, and then a few more schools going to none, schools for blind. But it's not going to be dramatic, but we're going to see a shift. I don't know if that considerable will be in the 30s, moderate will be in the 40s. It's going to definitely change how it's weighed in a predominantly test optional world. So that's one thing that we expect to see as changing. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes here doing a quick overview of the differences. Some of you, this is not going to be needed, but some of you are newer. There's a kind of a range in the audience tonight. So for some of you who are for your first time with testing, a quick primer before we get back to more of the nuance of this year and next year. The SAT has more advanced reading. It was redesigned in 2016. And with a higher level of critical thinking, evidence-based thinking, and higher level of reading. On average, the passages on the SAT, when we put them through the Flesch-Kincaid textual analysis tool by the government, the reading level is on the 11th grade reading level for the SAT versus the 9th grade for the ACT. So there's more advanced reading. That's just how it's designed. And the ACT has more advanced math content, and there's a standalone proper science section, which has actually some, but 7 of the 40 questions require some outside science knowledge. So there is definitely more science. It's more of a robust science test than what you have on the SAT. They overlap about 80%. So when you're prepping for one, you are de facto prepping for the other. They overlap with reading skills, English grammar, science, craft reading, algebra. Again, there's harder math and science on the AST, and there's harder reading on the SAT. And there's more reading everywhere. Longer passages, more advanced vocabulary in the passages. You're going to have, there's more reading in the math section. There's just more reading everywhere in the SAT. They overlap. Ignore the optional essay for the SAT. That's going to be gone in a matter of a few days. But they both have a big block of reading, a big block for writing English, a big block for math. Though on the SAT, there is a no calc math section. Not a big deal, but they're going to ask you to do some long division by hand, some working with decimals and fractions. And then there is a standalone proper science section. That's 40 questions, 35 minutes on the ACT. Then you have often an experimental section where they're trying to pre-test items for the future to make sure there is no bias in the items, to make sure they are the right level. They have the right level of number 4s and 5s and really hard items and really easy items in the same test. So it's a properly balanced test. So the curve is relatively stable. All right. One big distinction back in 2016, when they released the new SAT back then, what they did, they took the same length of test and they cut down the number of items quite substantially. And they allowed kids to have more time per question on the SAT. So you have roughly 40% more time per question, which is profound. And that's been a big difference for kids. Before this, back in 2013, 14, kids had a much harder time finishing the SAT. Since then, much less of a problem. Whereas on the ACT, speed is essential, especially for the science section and also for reading and for math. Much less so for writing, which is grammar. Those are pretty quick hitters. But kids really have to move quickly and learn how to use speed to their advantage and use the clock when it comes to the science. So processing speed is still privileged on the ACT, less so on the SAT. Mathematics is one area where they did diverge. The Common Core, the ACT was better Common Core aligned, like in 2012, 15, 14, when the ACT was racking up all these statewide contracts. So the College Board said, we can play in that game too. And they said, we're going to totally realign our test, more Common Core, verbal skills, and definitely we're going to make from the Common Core skills down, we're making a Common Core math test. And they did. And so every single item on the SAT tracks with a Common Core state standard. So before, there used to be SAT math that only lived on the ST, never again. Now it is directly tied to the curriculum that's adhered to by almost the vast majority of states in the country. So they in the Common Core math, if you know what the Common Core math is, there was big to do about this 10 years ago. Under the Obama administration, they were pushing this. The Common Core math is more about applied math and math fluency. Can I read text and extract the math versus can I give you an abstract math equation and have you solve it? So there's much more reading, which in real life, life is full of word problems. Life is rarely, here's this math, solve it. So you're going to see a lot more of that, more word problems on the SAT. Now, a few differences. There's more reading. Again, you always have, there's one no calc section on the ACT. They always test things in isolation. And then there's a broader range of concepts tested. The SAT is going to be a lot of algebra, a ton of algebra. And algebra, like they want to know about algebraic, like functions. They want to know about graphing, things like that. The ACT also has a lot of algebra, but they have a lot more geometry. When they revamped the SAT, they said, how many kids really need geometry for college? And this is, we're doing a college admissions test. Most kids don't use geometry in college. Therefore, they really scaled back geometry to about 2 questions, maybe 3 per test. Whereas geometry accounts for a fourth of the test on the ACT. They both are going to have a data analysis, a little bit of light stats, some graphing, charts, tables, and trig. You're going to have 0 or 1, maybe 2 trig questions on the SAT. Typically, you have 4 on every ACT, so a little bit different. And the range of content, you have a lot broader, more challenging content on the ACT. You're going to have matrix multiplication. You're going to have conic sections. They expect you to know how to work with the formula for an ellipse, circle, parabola, hyperbola, domains and ranges of functions, vertical and horizontal asymptotes approaching these lines of fit. There's just harder math on the ACT, and there's more of it. So our book has to be even broader for the ACT for math. And the question is, which one do you go with first? And ultimately, Colleges don't care which one you go with. The question is which one's higher. We recommend strongly having an unprepped baseline for both and figure out where you're stronger and then go with that one. And then you could use your Psat as a proxy. Those line up directly with vertical scaling. If you take both tests and you are within 60 points, there's a margin of error like 30 points on each test. So if you're within 30 points of both, you're in the range of indifference. On a given day, you could do better on one or the other. So what that means is if I score, let's say, an 1180 on the SAT and I score 27 on the ACT, I'm in the margin of error. I could flip those numbers. So there's no, defining difference or advantage. However, if I score, let's say, a 29 on the ACT and I score an 1180, I am much better on the ACT. And I should put all my energy towards that test and I should ignore the SAT entirely. So, but if you're in the middle range, just ask your student which one felt more natural, which one felt more like, and this is more your test, and go with that one. Because again, colleges are indifferent. It's just where you have a higher score in terms of the percentile score. Ideally, students should take this thing 3 times. That's on average. We have about data for 20,000 plus students, and typically our students tend to max out on average on their 3rd test. What that means is they have their first test, they go and take it again. Most things increase, if not all sections. And then on the 3rd test, you see a sectional improvement in 1 or 2 sections. That's for the average student. We definitely have students who are 1 and done. We have students who are 2 and done. But over the course of looking at tens of thousands of student data points, we see improvements through the 3rd test. And so that's, and then again, most students do their testing during the junior year, because in many cases, they're going to be applying to school when they're seniors and for early. Early means I have to have my testing done by September or October at the very, very latest. There's some question, are there easy or hard test dates? And the answer is no. On average, these things all wash out. So if someone tells you the March test is really, really, really hard, don't take it. Or May is really easy, ignore that. That's an error. On a given year, there's variability. Let me see this. So in a given year, March could be harder than May, easier than June, but that could all reverse the next year. So there are no clear patterns year over year looking at data for a decade. Same thing for the ACT. Things that matter, this was part of my graduate school doctoral research, things that predict performance on the SAT practice tests, they matter. They improve scores. Kids who do more practice tests get higher scores. That was very clear. Students who spread their practice out over time do better than those who mass it together. So it's much better to do it over 2 months than 2 weeks. Kids who started earlier had higher outcomes than those who waited till later in the year. Kids who put in more time, they do better naturally on most things, on your AP exam, on your SATs, on your chemistry exam. Time on task thus predicts performance. Also some momentum towards the end. You don't want to do all your prep over the summer and then wait 6 months and take it cold. That's obviously not going to be a good strategy. And then finally, having a goal is very helpful for students. It provides some motivational gains as you're moving towards that goal on your practice tests and so forth. So I want to do better isn't as motivating as I want to get a 1330. I'm starting with 1150 and I can see my progress towards that goal. It's helpful. All right, so testing. Absent the SAT subject tests, absent the essays, things are simpler now than they were 4 months ago. Here is the current timeline. Things are normalized. We had some very bizarre timelines during the pandemic. During one stage, between September, August, and October, we had 7 ACTs. It was crazy. That's not going to happen again. Things are, and also there was a September SAT. Things are all back to normal again because, by and large, testing has resumed normalcy. We're pushing through over 250,000 kids now per test. Essentially, we're back to the numbers before the pandemic, which is really impressive. Things are still a little bit off in certain marketplaces, some on the West Coast, some of our kids in Seattle, in LA, in the Bay Area are having a little bit of trouble. But by and large, we have students in Houston and Chicago, Texas. Things are, kids who want testing are getting testing. So access is not the problem that it was. And especially now when they reversed guidance, or now, most of our kids are now getting vaccines. And even so, with masking and distancing, they're saying you can have a distance of 3 feet apart, not 6 feet, which creates massive increases in throughput and efficiency and so forth. So now you can be, a classroom that could only seat 12 kids 6 feet apart can now seat 20, 22 kids. So throughput, it's just going up. And that was part of the new guidance from the CDC. They're saying they found no differences. And now so many of our kids are getting the vaccine, which is lovely, and they can go in there and feel safe. And the same thing with school and everything else. Now, in terms of what's going on with the ACT, we were all surprised last month when we got the big news that computer-based testing, which was going to come out in September of last year, of 2019, and sectional testing, they have been delayed for potentially a very long time. And part of it, we're not sure in terms of the direction. There's new leadership here. Martin Rorta was the CEO of the ACT for about 5 years. Wonderful guy. I respected him a lot. But there were some issues and some financial challenges, and he was pushed out last summer. And Janet Godwin came in, and she's the new CEO. And she may have said, this, in terms of our strategy, where we're going, maybe we shouldn't go this direction. We don't know this. I was so excited that kids were going to be able to go in there and just, after they'd taken one full ACT, they were going to be able to go in there and just take math and then go home, or just take science and then go home, which would have been incredible for kids to free up their weekends. That would change how they prepare once they had already pushed away 3 sections. And also kids with disabilities, some kids with double time or triple time, a test could take them, 12 hours. And so to go in there and just have math and leave would have been so wonderful for our kids with disabilities. But they're backing off this. And they've also backed off any mention of computer-based testing. And so Kenton Pauls, the National Director of Higher Ed, said after long consideration, we will not be rolling out sectional testing in this current year. So it's not going to affect anyone this next year. We don't know when, because they're going to have to do a pilot. They're going to have to roll it out. But it may be they're reversing course. Right now on their ACT.org, they have removed every mention of remote testing and every mention of computer-based testing and sectional testing. So we really don't know what their plan is. We just know they scrubbed the website and they announced they're backing off any deadlines for this coming year. So curious where things are going there. One thing that is happening, they promised us a super score, and now it's here, that automatically the ACT is going to generate a super score for you if you take more than one test. It's going to be on your site. You can go and log in and then submit the super score. It'll look like this. And so in their super scoring, if you have a national, a regional, or state test on a school day, like the April 19th, that was a national, that was a school day test. But then you had the national ones on September 18th and December 18th. So they're mixing and matching your best scores from all of those to make your composite. But these days, a lot of schools are doing self-reporting. And so you actually get to report your own scores to the colleges. And only once you are accepted, once you're admitted, do you have to spend the money to go and send a score report. But you can press a button and send this score report from to submit this to my schools. And you can also submit the individual test score reports if you want to. But this is pretty handy, and it saves folks a few dollars. And I think it's a nice gesture. And so forth. The College Board, they had promised us that the first week of April, they were announcing more details to come about a more flexible, streamlined digital SAT. Now, when I read those words, flexible, streamlined, digital, it's okay. This is going to be computer adaptive testing, which is lovely. We've had that before. We had that with the GMAT. We had that. It's adaptive on the GRE, other tests. And adaptive is lovely, because adaptive testing, every item you respond to, the next item is informed by your performance. And so they can really narrow down exactly which questions to feed you, which ones are relevant for you. And they'll not give you questions that are not relevant for you. If you're clearly above a certain level or below a certain level, there'll be very specific, tailored questions. And you can get to the right answer of what your score is more efficiently. One example of this is about 2 months ago, Toefl, the test of English as a foreign language, announced that they are shifting to an adaptive test. Their adaptive test is 50% of the length. And so they say, of course, we love our full length test, which is $200 and it's 4 hours, but for $120, it's half the cost and it's half the time. That would be such a boon to our kids to have a 2-hour SAT. That would be lovely, but I don't know. Again, April 5th is come and gone. So the question is, are they pausing? Are they hedging? Are they waiting? Will it come out this summer? We have no idea. So promises made, promises not kept. But we're going to see where this goes. But I am personally in favor of item response theory and computer adaptive testing, which is really efficient and accurate. And that's why the GMAT and the GRE, it makes sense to go there. It'll help kids. The APs are underway. My students have been wrapping up their AP weeks. And we know this year they're a little bit different. We have 3 rounds. We had the first round, like the May 3rd through 7th, and then 10th through 12th, and the 17th. Then the round 2 will be a combination of both in school and at home. If you have approval from the testing coordinator and the college board. And then round 3 will be June 1st through June 11th. And one of the reasons for this is that this year testing was really disrupted. Testing was, delivering the curriculum was disrupted. One of my nieces lives in Midlothian outside of Richmond, Virginia. And their teacher advised them, if you guys can get a refund on your AP exams, because they've been remote the whole year. We don't plan to cover more than half of the content on your AP exams. So it's like, what do you do? They've been remote. They had for a while, it was asynchronous. They've covered half the material. And so these kids, and so even giving them until June the 1st is a little bit helpful from May the 3rd, but they're not going to be able to cover all of it. But that's one of the reasons for capacity, making more capacity for distancing, and for those students who are just so behind by no fault of their own because of COVID's impacts. And so it's going to be a full year of material. My students have already been taking these and so forth. And it's going to be coordinated. The AP coordinator at the school can authorize the full take-home exam. And so those things are in there. And they have to use a desktop or a laptop. Last year was very different. Last year, they were short tests. They covered only through March. It could be on a tablet. Now these have to be on a desktop or a laptop. And they were working with hundreds, or if it's not thousands, of community-based orgs to make sure that kids who are lower income, inner city kids, had access, or rural kids, to testing if they didn't have good internet in their homes. So this is going to happen in the next, starting on the 18th. So whenever that is. Today is the 19th. So actually, they're already underway, matter of fact. All right. Now, one of the biggest stories of all last year with testing has to do with test optional coming in an enormous wave. I've been watching it come in since it became a story like 2008 or 9, like when Wake Forest went optional. And then there have been some other schools, Smith and American, George Mason, Worcester Poly went back, like they're about 14 years in. But then like Chicago went in 2018. And every year, a few schools, that were very selective jumped in the wagon. And then suddenly COVID, and everyone's in because kids couldn't take tests. All over the country, last April and May, there was no tests happening in the country. And then last June, you had demand for like 300,000 kids. They only had spots for 65,000 kids or so. So that's when schools were like, we're going optional. We cannot possibly ethically require tests when our students can't get them. And forget ethically is practically. And so that was the thing. So you had an extra 600 plus schools go optional from the year prior to and many of them were the most selective schools in the country. And that was the big story. And so the top research schools, liberal arts schools, it was all being driven by the pandemic. And now what we're seeing test optional extensions coming in from many good schools, from the Penn, BU, Vassar, Princeton, UT Austin, Harvard, Notre Dame, Kentucky, Kansas, Miami, Washington State, Illinois, MIT, VA Tech, Pomona. All these good schools are saying, as we were last year, so next year. Because honestly, a good part of this year, when many juniors would have been testing, access was still impaired. And so they're like, to be safe, to be fair for everybody, and not in all markets. I live in Atlanta. In Atlanta, testing has not been that disrupted. I've been tweaking and playing with my College Board account, my UT account, and within 5 miles of my house, there are like 3 test centers. There had been for most of this academic year. Testing really wasn't disrupted very much in Atlanta compared to our kids in Seattle. I've been testing that, and those kids had to drive an hour and a half, 2 hours. Sometimes there was nothing available for months. So very, very different experiences based on your geography. But many of these schools are like, you know what, giving everyone benefit of the doubt, let's just extend our policies a year. There are a few schools, Amherst, Penn State, Illinois, Pitt, Williams, who are saying that only will be extended this year, but also the year after that. So these are the extensions coming in. And some of them, they're doing like a pilot, essentially. They're looking at, they're going to be getting data and seeing, is there a difference between kids with testing and without, and should that impact any kind of long-term move we're making? And so many schools who are currently optional are going to remain optional, though some are going to revert back. So there was an Inside Higher Ed survey where about 70% said they expected that they were optional or blind, they were going to stay that way after the pandemic. They saw some benefits of this policy. There was a major study that came out by Ernst & Young and Parthenon. It was paid for by the ACT. And they called up 207 admissions officers and say, what are your plans? Where are you going to be in 3 to 5 years? And so this is a pretty important slide for you who are in the pipeline. So about a quarter to a third of schools are going to require testing. Then roughly 2/3 of schools are going to be optional, and about 5-10% will be test blind. And this was, something of a relief for the ACT. They didn't know because, there have been a few schools who went blind in the pandemic and said, and test blind, that is, even if you have the most amazing test score or the absolute worst test score, it is not going to factor in. We are blind to it. We can't see it. It's not going to factor in at all to admissions. And so they didn't know how big that was going to be. It turns out it's a pretty small slice of the pie. But optional has blown up. It used to be optional was 30-some% of schools, 40, and now it is, well over half. So that is a major lasting change that has come from the pandemic. Many schools, though, we saw the small number of schools who give extensions. Many of them want to wait and see before they make any permanent move. Because it really is interesting now, because now, well, the vaccines are here, and that's changed everything. And now if you're 12 years old or above, which is everyone taking ST, you can get a vaccine, and which means you can go and test fully vaccinated. That's a huge deal. And also guidelines for distancing are down, and testing throughput is way up. So testing access limitations, capacity constraints are essentially being wiped out. A few places still have a little bit of wrinkles on the West Coast, but by and large, everywhere, if you want testing now, you can get it. But they still, some of them, want to wait and see, and they're still trying to figure out, do we want to go forward with this? We saw some benefits from test optional, but were there costs? Did we lose something by losing testing? In some flagships, we might see some schools do a system where, like in Colorado, where Colorado State and Boulder and School of Mines might say, we're going to require testing, but then lesser, schools who are not as selective, Adams State, Colorado Mesa, Western, may be test optional or test blind. Recently, there was big news about a week ago out of Georgia. The entire University of Georgia system, including the highly selective, the Georgia Technology, Georgia Tech, they and UGA and Georgia State, Georgia Southern, all like 15 plus schools in the Georgia system have now required testing again for next year. That was a big move. And we heard this from Rick Clark, who is the head of admissions for undergraduates at Georgia Tech, who's also a friend and a colleague. He spoke at a national conference and said, when it comes to going test optional and staying there, do not look to the South. And Rick talks to his colleagues and peers at North Carolina and NC State and UNC and Alabama and Missouri, and part of it, like Florida, never dropped the requirement. Florida was test required all the way through, and part of it is because how closely allied their testing is with their merit-based scholarships. The same thing in Georgia. I live in Georgia. We have this thing called the Hope Scholarship, where if you have a certain GPA and certain testing thresholds, you get guaranteed tuition reductions. Like the Zell Miller Scholarship, which is the highest scholarship here in Georgia, you have to have a 3.7 on your GPA, but you also have to have either a 1200 or a 26 on the ACT. And then given that, you can hit the highest scholarship threshold. And so for things like that and other merit scholarships, they decided to reinstate testing for all schools in Georgia. And we're waiting to see over the next couple of years, will North Carolina come back in, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, so the South may be a place where testing really does return. Whereas other states like Oregon, they're very clear, we want to be optional. And so it has to do with the philosophy, and the drives and motivations of different school systems. And so it varies. And a lot of folks, though, they want data. Some of them say we want to have 2 years of data, 3 years of data to figure out, are there differences between the kids who have test scores and don't have test scores? Some schools like Worcester Poly say, you know what, we have the data, the submitters, non-submitters, we don't see big differences. But then There are schools like, the head of undergraduate admissions at Yale, Jeremiah Quinlan, went on record. He said, for our students, a better predictor, right now, looking at high school GPA versus testing is a better predictor of performance at Yale than high school GPA. That's pretty powerful. So do I think Yale will go test blind and lose their best predictor for who will do well at Yale? Probably not. The same thing, I've seen research out of UGA. It's older now. It's on the older SAT. When they redesigned it in 2005 and 6, and they added the writing section, it turned out that yes, the SAT was a better predictor of performance at UGA than high school grades. And they found a similar thing at the University of California research, but the regents just gutted testing. And that had to do with, there was an ADA lawsuit filed about kids during the pandemic couldn't get their accommodations. And so they sued, and a federal judge in Alameda County, Brad Seligman, he said, well, if you can't get your access, you can't have testing this year. And so he had an injunction against the system. And then the regents, the head of the California regents, John Perez, was vehemently anti-testing. They were doing this comprehensive analysis of the impact of testing, and Perez said, can we vote before the data is even finished? He wasn't even interested in the data. And so it turns out they had a settlement, and they decided to gut testing. It wasn't about anything other than the political will of the Board of Regents, and that they aren't educated. The educators voted, it was like 57-0 to keep testing, but the regents said, no, we're done with this. So that was a very political move. But so California is doing their thing. Georgia is doing their thing. Yale will do their thing, Georgetown, other schools, but there's not going to be any one thing. Every school will make this determination based on their data and based on their institutional priorities. What do they want to do? It wasn't, the data didn't drive California. It was their priority. We believe this will change things with ethnicity or race or access. Forget the data. Other schools say the data says this, we're going with the data. So it depends on where you are on the spectrum. But every school will be different. And so expect things coming in. It's important that you realize that test optional and test blind are a world apart. These are not the same thing. Test blind means whatever you have, we can't look at it. Test optional means if you send it, it's part of your application. And if it's good, it can help. If it's not good, it can hurt in many cases. So part of it is being mindful of that. And so if a test optional school, test scores can factor in. Test blind, there aren't that many schools in the country that are blind. Permanent test blind, during the pandemic, Loyola University in New Orleans, very small school, they went blind. Northern Illinois, Michigan. Catholic, they're somewhat selective. One of the bigger news beats was Worcester Poly. They've been optional for 14 years, and they're a research-based school. They're more of a STEM school, and they came out and said, we're not using test scores. They've been committed to this for over a decade and a half, and so they decided to go permanent blind. And University of California, they went blind because of a settlement made by the Board of Regents to settle a pandemic thing about accommodations. It wasn't about that was very different. Caltech, they're blind for 2 years. They announced that, and so for this year and next year. And then also we have Cal State, CUNY, Dickinson, Idaho, Reed, San Xavier, and Washington State. So there aren't that many. Most schools are optional because optional gets you where you have to be. If you have problems with testing, it's okay. Blind means if you scored a perfect score, it's irrelevant. And most schools feel you lose something because there are kids, even the kids, lower income, first gen minority kids who happen to score pretty well. And if you're test blind, you can't use that. And so you actually could be hurting certain students who could benefit if they had average grades, but really good test scores, and they're first gen kids. So there are many reasons why schools are not going to go blind. And so another piece that not sending test scores can affect merit-based aid. There are many schools I mentioned, for the Hope Scholarship here in Georgia, that they allocate the highest level of merit aid based on test scores and grades. Wabash, their merit awards are very clear. As your grades go up and your testing goes up, they keep giving you more money. So if I have a 3.2 and a 21 on the ACT, they'll give me $17,000 off my tuition. If I go up to a 29 on the ACT and have a 3.9, they'll knock off another $15,000 per year. So that's real money. That's profound. Alabama is famous for using merit-based aid to tremendous effect. They have transformed their school. When I was applying to school, Alabama was not a rigorous academic school. It was a pretty major backup for my peers here in Atlanta. If you can't get in Georgia, in Alabama, it really wasn't. That was a safety school for so many of my peers. But these days, Alabama isn't a safety. And for some, it's becoming more of a reach. The same as UGA used to be a safety. Now UGA is a reach also because of the Hope Scholarship. So Alabama, you can see this, given a 3.5 GPA, which is pretty common. There's been a lot of grade inflation over the past 20 years. Many kids have a 3.5. As you keep getting extra points on the ACT or the SAT, you can see the number is going up. Going from a 27 to a 29 on the ACT will save you $28,000 over 4 years. Going from a 29 to a 30, I just made $36,000 off tuition. And if I get to a 32, my tuition drops from $30,000 a year down to $2,000 a year. That's meaningful. And there are many people who are getting into great schools, but they're looking at this equation and saying, holy cow, I can go to the honors program in Alabama, and then I can apply for grad school at those other schools. And so let me work the money angle here, because the majority of the money comes undergrad for getting a good deal, getting good aid. Alabama is showing you an example of what happens with merit-based aid. So they spent over $100 million in merit-based aid, up from $8.3 million. And look at what's happened. Like their average GPA for last year's class was a 3.83. It's Alabama, up from a 3.4, and below that was like up maybe a 2.8, 2.9. And the top quarter scored a 32. And then this year, the freshman class, 2020, you have 40% with a 4.0, and you have like 40% scoring over 30. Alabama isn't the school that it was decades ago. And they've used merit-based aid for tremendous effect and impact. Test optional, they have another big story. So applications were up all over the place. Powerful, and early. The pandemic drove so much action in the early world. And Harvard, Columbia, UVA, look at these numbers. So they have tremendous gains. Normally you see a gain of 10%, 5%, like 30%, 40%. So many more kids are applying early decision, early action. That's been a huge thing. And the regular apps off the charts. NYU, 100,000 for, some 5,000 kids going to be going. It's amazing. UCLA, 140,000 apps. Duke, I remember when the Duke had 12,000 applications. Now they're at 50,000. So it's incredible. So their rates of acceptance have plummeted. Colgate doubled their. So the pandemic really popped applications. And part of that was driven by the going test optional. Once you're optional, kids who would have opted out because of low test scores are like, what the heck? Let me apply. So many more kids are applying. What's happened is schools who are selective have now become hyper selective. That's a trend, which is not a happy trend for many kids. But also, this didn't happen universally. There are many schools who didn't see this kind of gains, many schools who aren't as selective. And there are several hundred schools who are at high financial risk because the COVID didn't help education. They lost so many revenues, revenues on the auxiliary side. There's tuition revenues, but then there's the dorms, other things, meal plans, those got wiped. Summer programming got wiped. And we're going to see more and more schools folding or closing departments or cutting doctoral programs because of the pandemic will ripple for years in higher education. But the big selectives, they got huge application numbers, but it also created real uncertainty around yield. And what yield is the number of kids who accept your offer divided by the number of offers you give. And yield rates have been dropping year over year, but then the pandemic, it's going to be a massive drop. So part of it, the way they hedge against being uncertain, and one of the ways they control uncertainty with yield management is they look at things which predict who will actually matriculate. And one of those factors was testing. And with testing gone, there's more uncertainty. So the way they're hedging against the uncertainty is by using longer and longer wait lists. And that is something that, but some schools, their freshman class is 4,000 kids and their wait list is 5,000 kids. So then it's like, wait a minute, maybe they're going to go 140 kids deep in the wait list. But they expect this year will be weird. This year, they're not sure if kids who are applying without test scores, are they going to matriculate or not? Because test scores do predict who will actually come for certain schools. We heard that from Rick Clark over at Harvard Tech. And different applicants applied this year. So we're just not sure. And it does seem there are some small gains in diversity at the selective schools, but it has to be the will of the admissions office. Going test optional, this research doesn't just pop your diversity numbers, but if you make a concerted effort and you read differently and you put different weights on things, that's how you get more diverse applicants and so forth. So here's some of the numbers giving evidence that these selectives just got more selective. The NYU dropped 3 percentage points. Colby went 13 to 8, Williams 12 to 8. MIT 7-4, Emory 19-13. Duke went from 11% to 5%. I mean, these are crazy numbers. Duke used to be 35%. Penn, when I applied to Penn, the admissions rate, I think, was like 30%. It was in the low 30s. And then it went down to 15, then 12, then 9. Now it's at 5%. So when I applied, it took 1 in 3 kids. Now it's 1 in 20 kids. That's amazing. But that's falling in love with a school like Penn. It's really hard when they take so few students, or Columbia 3.7%. That's just insane. I remember when they were over like 15%. Anyhow, so the question is, will they go back from this? We don't know. We're going to find out. So there is a question of, are we seeing more qualified applicants, or just more applicants, more kids who wouldn't have applied who are now applying? There's a change, and I talked to a lot of good schools, good publics, good privates, and they're saying their matric lists haven't changed that much. And the kids getting in last year are still roughly similar, although there are definitely more, deferrals, more wait list activity this year, and so forth. Cornell, talked to one of my colleagues on a presentation, and he said, you know what, and this is actually from their news release, that when we stopped requiring testing, they began putting more focus on other things, which is natural. So if you don't have a test score, we're going to put more focus for your read on your rigor, your GPA, other learning activities, other testing, other essays, and your counselor and teacher recs, which is very rational. Absent that, these things grow in the algorithm. And normally, in a non-COVID year, schools who were test optional had a pretty small lane of kids who got in without test scores. So American, it was about 15% or so of kids who were accepted had no test scores. Brandeis, around 10, 12%. Smith, 14%, 15%. Bowdoin Bates, around 20 or so percent. So the number of kids getting into these schools without test scores was, call it a quarter, 10, 15, 20%, quarter of students. This year, not the case. This year, the number of kids applying without test scores, it plummeted. It went from about 80% of kids had test scores who applied to the Common App. That number dropped down to 44%. That's compelling. And there were issues. Part of it was, in many parts of the country, kids just couldn't get testing. And so why would you send test scores? Or they had 3 canceled in a row, and they took it one time and it wasn't a good score. They didn't want to send it. Or it could have been they didn't score as well and they wanted to submit without test scores because their scores weren't going to be a strength. So many reasons why kids didn't submit last year, but it was a pandemic year. It was an unusual year. So I want to put a little bit of nuance on that. If you read the Common Data app for non-first gen kids applying to larger schools, it really varied tremendously by how selected the schools were. Schools who were more selective, who turned down more kids, a lot more kids sent test scores, which makes sense because you're trying to, fight for a spot in a crowded field. You want to send everything you can to help you have a strong application. So in the private schools, about 6 in 10 kids sent test scores, for the highly schools that were selective versus about 4.5, out of 10 at schools who are less selective. Same thing for the publics. If I'm applying to Michigan, or I'm applying to Texas or UVA or Maryland or, Washington or UGA or Tech, about 2/3 of kids sent test scores to those flagship schools versus under half to the publics who were less selective. So again, the selectivity did predict submission rates. And also, Jeff Selingo is a source of data for us all. Academic researcher said there were big differences by major. He talked with one university, a big public university, and they said, so we saw a big difference in kids applying with scores from STEM kids. That 3/4 of our engineer applicants had test scores. They wanted to show off their math scores. About half of the business kids, but only about 1/3 of the kids in gen ed, social work, and so forth. So that's one distinction. And we don't know what's going to happen. The assumption is, naturally, given the end of the pandemic disruption to access, more kids will submit test scores going forward. But we don't yet know what the new normal will be like. I'm assuming it's going to be below what it was. So in the test optional realm, I don't think we're going to see an average of 15% of kids getting without test scores, but it's probably not going to be 50%. It'll be somewhere in that range, maybe 25, 30, and it'll vary by the school and their philosophy. There was a question early on, was there an advantage with the early rounds? And we saw that Tufts didn't seem to be an advantage for having test scores or not. Same with Williams. But then looking at Penn, it looked like there was an advantage, that they were letting in more kids off ED with test scores. And then Georgetown was a pretty clear advantage. So their overall rate of acceptance was about 11%. That rate was about 7.3% for non-submitters. And the assumption is it's going to be over 12% for kids who have test scores. So Georgetown is giving a clear signal. We like testing. If you have it, send it. And the biggest impact here, Jeff Selingo talked to the admissions directors at Emory, Colgate, Tech, and Vandy. And these numbers are very powerful. Anyone who thinks test optional and test blind are the same thing, this slide's enough. So for Emory, the percent of kids who got in with test scores to Emory, 17%. And those getting into Emory without test scores, 8.6%. That's double. At Colgate, same thing, 12% without tests, 25% with tests. At Georgia Tech, those admitted without tests, 10%, and those admitted with tests, 22%. So again, test optional does not mean test blind. That's kind of the stamp of this one. If you have a good test score, it can help you. And that's very clear by these numbers. And also he said there was a real difference. One university dean said admissions rates are very similar, except for STEM kids. That for STEM kids and business kids, kids with test scores got in at much higher rates for the engineers and the math majors and the fin majors and so forth. So the question becomes, do I want to send a test score or not? Do I prep or not? Now, a weak score is not going to help you and it may actually hurt you, but a strong score can help you and communicate strength. It can also affect merit-based aid and placement and so forth. And so the real question you want to ask is, will my score add value and strength? Will it make me a stronger applicant? And we know that GPA and rigor are going to be big, but testing can still be part of the conversation. So I had talks with a few of my colleagues over the past year. Jamie Hansard said, look at the profile. If you're in the bottom quartile, probably don't send it. It probably won't help your chances. But if you're in the middle 50, you may want to submit based on whether you believe it'll add value. Sean Felton, Cornell, their mid 50 range for verbal is 680 to 760. And for math, it's 720 to 800. And so Sean said, you know what, I probably wouldn't send a score below a 650 because that is so well below our that's kind of low in the bottom quartile. And so he said, I would hold those. Rick is very candid. Rick is great. And he said, you know what, if you're in the top half, send the score. That's great. In the bottom half, I consider it if it'll add strength. But if you're in the bottom quartile, for us, I wouldn't send it. Because again, the bottom quartile of students, those are kids who may bring something else besides pure academic strength. They may have something that institutions want. They may have a skill, an athletic skill, a fine arts skill. They may be a development student where their uncle or dad or grandfather gave a lot of money to the school, and they want to make sure they, are generous, with those families. It could be an alumni. Students who have diversity the school wants. There are many things, many reasons why the bottom quartile, they'll take lower test scores. So if you're in the lower test score, the bottom quartile, and there's no hook, Rick would say pretty much I probably wouldn't send that score. I probably withhold that score. And so part of it, treat every school differently. You may get a 29 on the ACT and you're applying to 10 schools. You may submit to 5 and withhold from 5. And do the calculus of will it help me, will it hurt me? It's going to vary. And also it varies on your GPA. If I have like a 3.9 unweighted, I have a killer GPA and fairly modest test scores, I want that conversation in the room to be only about my rigor and my test and my GPA. Don't bring in a 23, which might pollute my 3.9 GPA. And so, however, that being said, if I have a 3.5, 3.6, then I have a 27, that's a very different story. And so part of it's thinking about what do I want to have dominate the conversation? My testing, my GPA, will my testing contribute or detract from? That's the important thing. And part of it, I spoke with the dean of admissions at a very selective school on the East Coast, and he was given the story of a student of his who applied, good kid, smart kid, had a good 3.8, 3.9 GPA, had a 94 in calculus. But then the kid submitted a 1 on AP Calculus. And he's like, oh God, what he said is, I can't unsee that score. And now looking at his 94, it's like, okay, a 94 connotes mastery, but he scored a 1. So does that mean there's a lot of grade inflation in this school? Does that mean how do I evaluate a kid who scored a 1? So His answer was, don't send me the 1. I don't want to see the 1. Send me a 4 or a 5 on the AP, or maybe a 3 if it's a school accepts them and gives credit for those. But like, don't send a weak test score, period, if you don't have to. One example, our closing slides, Swarthmore, strong school academically. For their verbal, their mid-50 is 680 to 750, and their math is 790, composite 1380 to 1540. So that's our range. Now, do I submit or not submit? If you're in the top half, 1470 or above, send the score. No question at all. Then if you're in the bottom quartile, if you have like a 1330, that's not going to impress the Swarthmore reps. I would withhold that score. The real question becomes that third quartile. If you're at the very top of the quartile of 1460, I'm more inclined to send it. But if I'm at 1380, less so. Unless if I'm applying to an engineering program, and then I have like a 770 in math and a weaker verbal, well, my math score matters a lot more. So I may have a lower score, but that 770 will shine with the people. I'm a STEM kid. And also my GPA, is my GPA 3.9 or 3.3, in which case will my testing help me or hurt me? So these are the things you factor in when you're doing the calculus. Do I send or submit? On every application you choose send or submit. Submit or withhold, rather. Those are my two choices. And we know that score ranges might change. Typically, when you go test optional, the score ranges go up about 25 points, looking at past research. But this year was so weird, and COVID was so weird. There was stress, and kids were taking it under harsh conditions with masks. And it was, I don't know. So we don't know what will happen with average test scores for this year. But we also know submission rates were really much lower this year. So in terms of the next thing, we help kids with all kind of things, all kind of tests, assessments, APs, SATs, ACTs. We help kids with private tutoring, group tutoring. We have an online, a self-paced option that's much, much cheaper. We're going to share now in the chat a link to the things that we do offer. And finally, for us, we do all this prep. We also help kids with executive functioning, coaching, with organization skills, and academic skills. We help kids with chemistry and with math and science and history. So we do all these things for kids. We have for about 20 years. All right, so now I see we have 19 questions waiting for me, and I'm going to open up my Q&A. So go ahead and type in any questions. I'm going to hang out for a while beyond 9 o'clock. I want to make sure I answer your questions. And here we go. So I am taking the June SAT using a fee waiver. Do you recommend that I remove it since it'll be discontinued anyway? The fee waivers, I don't know what that is. I'm not sure. If you have a fee waiver, I would say go ahead and take it. I don't think they're going to be getting the fee waivers. Okay. Is it expected that I sign the waiver to not read my letters of recommendation? Yes, there is something that if you don't sign it, then it kind of puts them, it changes the way your rec letter writers write, if they know you're going to read it, because sometimes they're honest. And so I think you want to sign away the right to read the recs. I think it's important and it makes it more honest. And the admissions offices, they understand that. Where do I find the recording? Alexandra, we're going to go ahead and send it to you. And give us a day. We have to render it and then send it out to you, probably Friday. When does registration open for the August SAT? We're in May. Go on the collegeboard.org. They'll have the exact dates. You can just Google it. But I'm assuming it may already be open now, but I would go on their website. That should be a fast answer on that one. Okay. To give any update on the sectional testing, that we mentioned that has been gutted. So sad. All right. Once you've taken both tests, the AST and ST, do they then focus on one or the other for future testing, or do you take both multiple times? So once you have both, you then narrow the focus on the test you want and ride that horse all the way in. Don't keep doing both. That's too much work, too much time and money. Don't do it. Choose one. And every year we're getting kids into Stanford, Harvard, MIT with one test. So anyone who tells you you need both, that isn't a thing. All right. Can you speak to how colleges are going to evaluate the AP on the transcript and the AP score if they're going optional or blind? Right. So the AP scores are going to loom a bit larger. We've heard that if you don't have test scores, we don't have an SAT or ACT, but we do have a series of scores on AP chemistry and physics, and and you do well on those become a larger part of the conversation. And so again, they're optional. They're not required by any means, But if you have 4s and 5s and you send them, they're going to be included in the discourse. They'll say this kid took 7 APs, oh, and he actually got a few 5s and 4s. And so absent testing, those can loom larger. And the question is, well, will they become like the new mandatory optional for certain schools? And I don't know about that, but it does seem like we've been moving away from requiring the subject tests. Like no one requires the AP scores, but if you have them, it does become a plus factor. Because again, you have 2 students who both took 7 AP exams, and one kid submits and has 5s on 4 of them and 4s on 3 of them, and one kid submits no scores. You have to assume the student who submitted all 4s and 5s did a lot better on their exams. Most kids who do really, really well don't withhold it out of some humility. You send your strong scores. And so it is going to be a factor, but it's not required at all. So if you don't have good scores, it's okay. But if you have good scores on the APs, they become a plus factor. Even in schools who are test optional, test blind. Do you know when AP scores will be available for us to see? I don't know this year because part of it, the strangeness of them having 3 rounds of this, they're going to have AP scores for the early May, late May, and June rounds. I'm not sure if they're waiting to release them all later in the year. But so I cannot help you there, Edward. Sorry about that. Notwithstanding the equity issue and testing, what's your opinion about how predictive are these tests in terming student success freshman year? In terms of the predictive strength, I mean, looking at the standardized task force at the University of California, it was showing there's a clear independent contribution to predicting performance, especially for minority students. That was something that was profound. At Georgia, their research shows clear. Yale, but honestly, it varies by school. There are schools where they found, like certain liberal arts schools, they're not as predictive based on the kind of classes, their grading system. So it'll vary from school to school. So there's not going to be one universal thing. But the College Board will have their data, but I look much more closely at institutional data from the colleges when they release that. But many of them say it does predict, which is why they use them. There are some concerns and complaints that these things are often collinear with parental income levels, but also income levels also predict freshman grades and graduation rates. So there are many things, there are issues of equity and access that are problems well beyond these tests. But it does seem, these things do provide a contribution to help predict performance, freshman grades, and even 4-year grades and graduation rates. That was what the finding of many research. What are some good SAT prep sites or ways to study? The most important one is Khan Academy. If I'm looking for a free site, I'll go to Khan. So we also have a self-prepping option at Applerouth. It's pretty darn comprehensive. It's very good. You can buy a book. We have a really strong book for sale. You can buy Princeton Review, Kaplan, Barron's, Gruber's. They're all pretty good. So there are options, but I would definitely use the freeware first because max that out. Also for the ACT, .org, they have some free software as well. The test optional extension of a year would apply to students who will be seniors this coming school year. Yeah, so kids who are going to be seniors in the coming year, they're going to be optional. So if you're currently a sophomore or rising junior, only the 2-year extensions, that's like Amherst and a few other schools and Pitt. But many schools are going to reassess. But honestly, when they reassess, according to that Ernst & Young Parthenon research, a lot of the schools who are going to be extending are going to most likely move into a permanent test optional. Only about a quarter of schools are going to revert back to test requirements, according to the data that we saw. So I think test optional really is going to be here to stay for a lot of schools and forever. So I think that the pandemic did change that. All right, my son took the test score and got 1100. Do you recommend he go to a test optional school and not submit scores? Well, it depends. If we're cold at 1100, do I think I can get, typically we can see gains of 150, 200 points. If we can get your kid up to a 1300, or if you can get her by himself, I mean, I increased my test score over 100 points doing self-prep. Looking at the schools on your list, do I think a score of a 1280 or 1300 would be helpful? And if not, if I'm looking at school, if I'm looking at Duke, then no, then I wouldn't submit a test score. If I'm looking at a school, if I can get to a 1300, there are hundreds of schools in the country where that would be a meaningful score, and that could even get you some merit-based financial aid. So based on where you're applying. And so it varies tremendously based on where you're looking. But yeah, for the very tops, like the schools, if you're applying to Columbia, don't send them your 1100. I wouldn't worry about testing in that regard. But can this recording be sent to our emails? Yes, it will be. All right. Do you think the UCs will ultimately make a test of their own? No, no. I think that's a fool's errand. The resources to make and norm and they might tweak the smarter balance test, which is slightly, but the idea of whole cloth generating a test, they're not good at that. And it's going to be really expensive and time intensive. And I think really the outgoing president last year, Jed Applerouth, said, I believe UC will be better with a test than without a test. And that echoes exactly the findings from the task force. But the John Perez and his second, and then the regents, they said testing is no good. And they were happy to settle and, this lawsuit, pay $1 million just to wash their hands of it and say, we're not going to take testing, for the next 5 years. So I think the most likely outcome for UC is they're going to be test blind. And we'll see how it plays out, but it's going to be more work for them. And we'll see how things work in terms of the diversity they gain and also 4-year and 6-year graduation rates. We'll find out. All right, my junior has completed hours of tutoring, and then his June center just canceled today. May was canceled too. Can you confirm? So what do we do with this? What can we do? So you're in California. Okay, in California, the West Coast is still wackier. Seattle, Cali, LA, Bay Area. What can we do with it with the effort? They're going to, there will be an SAT this summer. There's an August SAT, and then there's going to be October. There will be a chance, and by then, I mean the rate of vaccination should be profound. It's going to be also, my every instinct tells me that there will be testing in California, though I'm surprised they canceled June. But August is months away, and then October. So I think the prep you put in is not going to be wasted. But do we provide admissions or essay help for California colleges? We will give you several referrals. So email us, Laura, and we'll give you several referrals of people who do the work. We have plenty of colleagues out in UC who are excellent in the California area to help you with those essays and applications. What level is a strong score? It depends dramatically by the school. A strong score, if I'm applying to UGA, if I have a 1320, that's great. If I'm applying to UVA, I like a 1400. If I'm applying to Penn, I would like a 1500, if I can get a 1480. So a strong score. If I'm applying to Georgia State, I want a 1250. If I'm applying to, so it really, it swings based on, what school you're applying to. So there is no one, quote, strong score. It's strong for this school. When are we taking an actual test? I'm not sure. Does super scoring apply for the SAT? Yes, super scoring is very prominent for the SAT. Now, the vast majority of schools in the country will super score the SAT, and a smaller number super score the ACT, but it's rising every single year. What is executive functioning coaching? That's something where we help kids with their levels of organization. Kids who have problems with distraction, they lose things, they don't prioritize things properly, they don't get help when they need help. That's work we do. So we're helping kids. I'm working with students myself. Some of them were failing, and now some of them are not failing. We're helping kids get a hold of themselves academically. And often it's part of the frontal lobe isn't fully developed, and they need some more help and more work. And just get skills, learn how to use resources, using their binders, organization, their calendars, reminders, all these things, their study environment, that kind of work. Are there any forms of financial aid for the courses? We do work with schools for financial-based aid, and part of it, there's a possibility, so you can reach out. We have different offerings, different levels from private tutoring to group tutoring to self-prep, where there's a financial option that may make sense for you. So I would reach out to our team. Do you suggest studying for the SAT after freshman year or the year later? Give it another year. Wait until sophomore year. We have some kids doing some prep late sophomore year, like the end at the earliest, but otherwise don't prep when you're a freshman or the end of freshman year. Wait, because part of it, there's content you haven't fully covered. Again, the level of reading for ST is a junior level of reading, and it covers Algebra 2, which for most kids, some kids are done as freshman year, but still, I wouldn't touch it until the end of sophomore year at the earliest. And the vast majority of our kids do their work and their prep when they finish sophomore year, like 90%. Has the September ACT registration opened up yet? I signed my son up for the July test, but I want to be proactive. I am not certain. You can go and log in, check for registration. You'll find that within a matter of a minute on Google. Looks like only June and July are open right now. Gotcha. So September may be open in a matter of a few weeks. I would check back, and they'll tell you there'll be a thing for registration deadlines and openings. It should be on the site when it begins. Do we prep kids for the Psat? Yes, we prep kids for the Psat, and also the Psat and SAT overlap dramatically. Essentially, how you score on the Psat will be the same score on the SAT for most kids. All right, if we have chosen certain universities on the ACT website, we'll be forced to send our scores. We can decide whether or not we want to send them. You get to choose, but part of it, you go there and uncheck if you don't want to send them your scores. Because right now, if you have it, you get 4 freebies, and they will send them to those 4 unless if they're checked. But you do choose. Okay. All right. And the actual ACT test dates, those are going to be, there's a test date in, there's one coming up in June, there's one in July, then September, and then October, then December. Our courses offered face-to-face. So we are now back to offering both online classes, and we're offering face-to-face. The vast majority of our tutors, they've been vaccinated. Students are also, things are so that's been in flux. For a long time, we had mask requirements, distancing, we had hand stuff, but now with the vaccine, things are definitely shifting and changing. And so we are working with that. And there is face-to-face is now back up in all of our markets. Can we get a link to the presentations? Yes. We're going to send you a link, and we're going to send you a video recording. Is it possible whether to choose to send AP scores every single time and to every single school? On the Common App, you decide, do I send scores or not? You only send them official scores for placement once you're accepted, but you choose whether to submit scores or withhold them from every school to which you apply. They don't get them automatically. You choose them or you withhold them. With a 1500, should I take this ST again? In most cases, no, it's a great score, especially during the pandemic year. But if it's my first effort and I get a 1500 and I'm applying to one of the top schools in the country, if I'm applying to Stanford, MIT, it's my first shot, I might take it again out of curiosity. Can I get a 1530? But that by itself is a very strong score. So for most schools in the country, you'd be in the top. But again, if you're applying the top 15 of the top 2,500 schools, and it's my first effort, but if it's my third effort, we're done, put it away. So, and also from applying to like Georgia, Alabama, we're done, full scholarship, we're great. Depends upon where you're applying and what test it was for you. Okay. We were told that UC is creating their own test. There is a proposal on the table for the Board of Regents to evaluate the likelihood of making their own test within 5 years. And right now it's either there was a feasibility analysis that was ordered, and it looks like what they found is making their own test whole cloth will be prohibitively expensive. So either they're going to modify the Smarter Balanced test, the SBAC, or they're going to gut it. So there's still the possibility of a modified SBAC, but there are problems with that one too. But them making up their own UC admissions test, I think is extremely unlikely, apart from slightly tweaking the Smarter Balanced test. Because making tests are hard. I mean, for every test, they spend over like $1 million to norm each test. It's a big deal. If we examine test scores for the SAT, they usually give a score range. While deciding to send it or not, can we use a lower end of these score ranges? Yes. So there's a middle 50 range for half the class is here to here, a quarter below, a quarter above. Now, that was part of my discussion. Like, so part of it is there's the middle of the range they give you, the middle and above, slam dunk. But the third quarter, if you're below that number, typically don't send it. But if you're in the bottom half of the range, it depends. That was kind of part of my discussion. In some cases, send it. In some cases, if you're the very bottom of that little range, I can withhold it if my grades and rigor are very strong. So that's where you have to do that kind of mental calculus. Will you comment again about geometry use on the testing? So yes, geometry has been dramatically reduced on the SAT. When it was redesigned, typically you're going to have 3 geometry questions of the 50 or so on the SAT versus about 14 or 15 on the ACT. So 23% of the ACT is geometry versus about 6% of the SAT is geometry based. There's a lot more algebra on the SAT. Where exactly should the student look to uncheck the automatic send their test scores? On their College Board profile, it's on your registration. So when you register, there's the ability to have your test scores forwarded automatically to 4 schools, and you can go onto the registration once you log in. You might also Google it because I haven't done this that often, but I know there is on the portal when you log in, you can change it up until the dates. Should I submit my AP CSP of a 5? Yes, always yes, absolutely yes, no question. Send all your 5s and even send your 4s, even if they're an easy, whatever. 5s and 4s will help you. 3s, it depends if they give credit. If not, I wouldn't send it. And they have it on their websites. They have credit for what classes. If a student doesn't submit a score, does it not look like the student is hiding a low score? Not always. I mean, part of it, if you don't submit a score, they don't like on an AP, you could have gotten sick on the day of the AP. You could have had mono. They don't know for sure, and they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. If I send them a 1, but I'd rather you just not send it than send a 1. And the same thing with the SAT. During the pandemic year, they had no idea if you couldn't take it, if you were like in LA or versus you have someone in your family was immunocompromised, you weren't comfortable, you were remote the whole time. I have kids who stayed at home because they had someone in their family that was sick. So, but after COVID, after the pandemic, I think that's going to change because there's less of a problem about access. So does it seem like you're hiding a low score? Not, in normal times, yeah, kids tend to submit scores that are strong. That is a pretty good assumption. But again, they don't know what exactly happened. The AP is a one-shot deal, but the SAT, you have 7 chances. So if you don't submit there, the assumption is you didn't do as well on it, which is a natural assumption. Because kids who do well send their scores. I've never met a kid out of pride saying, I don't want to send it. I want to earn my way in without my test scores. I've never seen it. That's in tens of thousands of kids. That seems to be a strange behavior. All right, that is the end of my questions. So everyone, have a lovely night. Thanks for being here. I hope you learned something. And feel free to share the information with others. And everybody have a good night.